And if you don't have ears left to listen, page 22 says it all. Okay, Marcus Borg, that generous and deep and gracious practitioner of the Christianity that he preached for so long, said in what turned out to be his final book, imagine that Christianity is about loving God. Imagine that it's not about the self and its concerns, about what's in it for me, whether that be a blessed afterlife or prosperity in this life. So here's the major part of what I'm going to say, and it's a series of questions. What are we doing? What do we think we're doing? And what do people who watch us think we're doing? We're in Epiphany, that great liturgical season in which we broadcast Jesus all over the place. Have you noticed that thus far in this season we've heard a great deal, and will hear a great deal, about discipleship? It starts with two different stories from two different Gospels about the calling of those fellows to whom he will later entrust everything. And it's followed by little snippets about their first on-the-job training and welcome. He does. The point is that he has them go with him to watch what he does. His teaching, his preaching, his healing, his nurturing. He's inviting everybody in with such radicality that it put more than a few Jerusalem and Roman noses out of joint. It's fairly clear and explicit in Matthew's Great Commission and in that long speech that Jesus gives on the last night of his life in the fourth Gospel, that what he's doing is asking them to be disciples. That is to say, what does he tell us to do? What are we supposed to do? What are we in the business of doing? What are we doing? We're making disciples, and then making some more, and then making some more, and teaching the ones that we've made to make some more in turn. Flip Wilson once said, "I'm a Jehovah's bystander. They asked me to be a witness, but I didn't want to get involved." That's funny, but it's also a little chilling. Vital congregations make vital disciples. That's one of their markers. They don't make bystanders or audiences, not even audience participants, but audiences. Maya Angelou once said that, actually says it several times, that she's often amazed when people come up to her out of the blue. She doesn't know these people, and they say, "I'm a Christian." And she says that she wishes she had the courage to respond by saying, "Already?" And from Brian McLaren, the life and death question for each of our churches and denominations may boil down to this: are we a club for the elite who pretend to have arrived, or are we a school for disciples who are still on the way? Go! Jesus said, "I didn't call you to be sacristy rats. I never asked you to worship me or even to admire me or form your own chapter of the I Heart Jesus fan club." And he certainly didn't invite us to stay in our local, family-friendly churches where we all know each other's names. It's good to be in church. It's good because that's the place where, in fact, we are nurtured and nurture others. But what he said was, go, make disciples of all nations. I think that's one of the reasons why those earliest of disciples, in that great thicket of non-recognition stories and the post-resurrection stories, did recognize him. Because here he said, go, do stuff. That's Jesus. What are we doing? What do we think we're doing? And what do people who watch us think we're doing? Making disciples is our business. That's what lifelong Christian formation is all about. Put simply, it's a game of follow the leader. Now, a number of you know Rob Bell, yes? Okay, so you know what he's known for. You know his book. They put a lot of people's angst in an uproar. And we know as Christian formation people his series of DVDs called Pneuma. And in one of them, the one called Dust, he describes discipleship and how it was done in the first century. And it's not just Rob being Rob. In fact, this is this is borne out by non-biblical first-century Jewish sources. And the heart of any of our formation programs, as far as we can tell, is about this, and it's about what our earliest forebears did in the faith for the catechumens that they had. What Jesus wanted from the first disciples was not their adulation, but their emulation. What he wanted was discipleship. True disciples don't have secret handshakes and magic decoder rings, or the most friends on Facebook, or secret rites known only to them. There are times in history, in our history as a church, that I wonder about that. Disciples speak what the fellow they follow speaks. They do what the one who taught them does. And they practice, and they practice, and they practice. When he called the first disciples, he must have surprised the heck out of them. Because these were, as Bell puts it, these were the ones who were the not good enoughs. These were the ones who had to leave school at about the age of 10, because all kids in Israel in the first century went to school. About the age of 10, many of them either left themselves to start the trades that they would later practice, or began the betrothal segments, or they were weeded out. Some of them, the best of them, would stay for a while, learn more stuff, but they'd go to a better center with a better rabbi and learn. By about the age of 13 or 14, most of those would be weeded out or go and get married. So the elite, the cream of the crop, would go to a central place, Jerusalem, to the most famous of rabbis and say, "May I take on your yoke?" Which meant, "May I learn your way of teaching and being?" And the rabbi, he had a reputation to uphold, the rabbi would really examine the kid. Not only did the kid know the Bible and know how to wrestle with the text and what the ancestors had said about the text, but did the kid know how to form his or her own, there were women rabbis, her footnote, her own conclusions. And even more than all that important stuff, the main question the rabbi had was, can this kid do what I can do? And if the answer was yes, the rabbi would say, then come and follow me. Now, what that means is those disciples whom Jesus subsequently called, the ones who'd been watching and stuff, they were the ones who hadn't been good enough. These are the ones who here the night he was arrested, the night before he died, they're the ones who get the command to love one another, to love the world, to bear the fruit. Those disciples had not made the academic cut when they were 10 or 15. Jesus thought, though they thought they weren't good enough, talk about shame, they thought they weren't good enough, he thought they were good enough. He thought they could do what he could do, and he says in John's Gospels, they're capable of doing even more and better than he can do. He trusted them, and he didn't even come back later to check on their progress. Now, Barbara Brown Taylor says in one of her little books that she wonders about the time between the resurrection and the ascension, and then right after the ascension. This is what she says: the Word had come back to entrust them with the Word. Then he disappeared for good, but his words didn't disappear. They lingered in the air, still pulsing with power. All they needed to do their work was somebody to speak them. So the disciples entered the cloud of sacred speech. Quoting him, they began to sound like him, and remarkable things happened to them when they did. People were freed, fed, healed, transformed. When the disciples spoke in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, their words became acts. There was no vacuum between their saying and God's doing. When they spoke in the name of the Word made flesh, God came to earth all over again. Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes not his, claims the poet. That initial family of disciples gathered for what we might call Jesus' last will and testament began to know that in fact Christ did play in them and through them, and eventually they began to act like they believed it. They did love one another, and they prayed for and served the hurting world around them. They bore the fruit, they loved the folks, and they shined. How they shined. And they led others to their own particular forms of real discipleship too. So what are we doing? What do we think we're doing? What do we hope to God those who watch us get when they watch what we're doing? Now, we make disciples with the various forms and programs and processes for children, youth, and adults. And the best of those programs and processes know that it's never enough to teach people about the history of the church or even about Jesus. It has to do with then taking all of that out into the present and into the future by continuing to do what he did, what he said in the present and into the future. In our little pockets of the world that God, for some reason that only God knows, so continues to love. One thing, does our liturgy, that central and primary place of lifelong and life-wide Christian formation, do its part? Remember Annie Dillard. Does anyone have the foggiest idea what sort of power we blithely invoke in our liturgy? It's madness to wear ladies' velvet hats to church, she says. We should all be wearing crash helmets. The ushers should be issuing life jackets and lash us into our pews. So 3 examples, just 3 from our own liturgies. Are the prayers of the people, the prayers of this people gathered in this congregation on this occasion? Or are we, as usual, trotting out they're lovely? They're lovely. One of the 6 forms in Rite 2, the only difference from week to week being the differing names that we sprinkle in. How are we teaching people to pray? Or are we allowing the gladness, the deep gladness in some of those who come into our congregations to rise? And the laments and the terrible experiences that people have endured during the last week or month or year, are they able to be spoken and heard? And what about the ills and horrors and massacres that happen in the world in which they live and move and have their being? Are they in fact being articulated and raised up? Are we teaching people how to pray? How are we forming them? Is the sermon a lecture? In many of your places, I'm sure it's not. But in some places, it's a lecture on some arcane bit of Hebrew or Greek. Now, I am a biblical theologian. I love that stuff. But that's not the place for it. Or is the preacher helping them to see the juncture between the ancient word and the modern world? Is the preacher allowing people to see that that ancient text, that series of wonderful texts, is reading their lives even more than they're reading it? And near the end, my favorite thing, near the end of our celebration, we pray together a prayer that, taken seriously, assumes that we know we're disciples called to do stuff in the world in God's name. And that Monday to Saturday is when our ministry shines and takes effect. This is what we pray. Send us now into the world to love and serve you, or in the alternate, send us out to do the work you have given us to do, or some other form, right? And then a deacon or somebody else says, go, or go to love and serve the world. Are we then propelled from the sanctuary out into that world to proclaim to some of the people that Mark was talking about, those poor, whoever they may be, or do we wait for the candles to be snuffed, or the prelude or the postlude to be played, and then wend our ways to coffee hour? Words matter. Symbols matter. What are we doing? How are we forming by what we're doing? Baptismal covenant, full of verbs. It assumes we're already doing this stuff. It doesn't, none of those vows start with the word if. It's all, but notice the action. Will you continue? Assuming we've been there. Will you continue? Will you persevere? Will you proclaim? Will you seek and serve? Will you strive? Follow the leader. Get skin in the game. Be a disciple, not a bystander. These are not the sorts of actions, this bearing of fruit that will last, these baptismal vows, the discipleship stuff that one does once, checks off the list, and tilts merrily on one's way. They assume things about us, that we know the traditioning, not the tradition, not the dead stuff, the traditioning of the church and of Jesus, that we wrestle with it anew in every generation to see what it all might mean for us in this new setting. And they assume that we don't simply know these things, but by God, we act on them. Now, several years ago, the church gathered in General Convention brilliantly passed the Children's Charter for the Church and followed that good work with a second one, the Charter for Lifelong Christian Formation. Some of the architects of those two documents are in this room, and we ought to continually thank them. As a lark, I Googled the term adult formation, and guess what comes up first? We do! It says the Episcopal Church. Good on us. Our charters are the stuff of lifelong catechal process that began in the infant church in the first generations. It's also, in an earlier form, the sort of stuff that Moses talked about in the wilderness, and it's a necessary series of stuff for us now, because we live in a country which often calls itself Christian, but often acts and speaks as if it had not heard the gospel, or if it had, that it only heard the gospel that agrees with it. We live in a society which has largely forgotten the ancient story and reduces it to sound bites, as if it understands the context for the phrases it glibly parrots. Dorothy Sayers, more than 100 years ago, made this observation. We have, she says, domesticated Jesus and made him fit companion only for staid old ladies and pale curates. We are a church which sometimes seems way too reticent about proclaiming who it is and what gifts it has been given to give back to the world. Now, I know that in speaking to you, I'm essentially preaching to the proverbial choir. But you believe in Christian formation, or you wouldn't have spent the time and money and energy that it took for you to be here. But even in the choir, among whom I am a singer, attention must be paid. I will. And we're coming to the end. Billy Collins. Thank you so much. My man. Billy Collins, that poet laureate of this country, wrote a number of poems about childhood that I think remarkable for somebody who's reached adulthood and actually has the right memory about childhood. And in one of them, it's called First Reader, he remembers Jane in a blue jumper, Dick with his crayon brown hair. And then he talks about how they would always be pointing at something. Look! Father mowing the lawn. Look, mother in the 50s in her apron at the kitchen door. Look at the dog. Lots of times, look at the dog. They wanted us to look, but we had already looked and seen the shaded lawn, the wagon, the postman. We had seen the dog, walked, watered, and fed the animal, and now it was time to discover the infinite clicking permutations of the alphabet small and capital letters. Alphabetical ourselves in the rows of classroom desks, we were forgetting how to look, learning how to read. Now, some among whom we serve in the church, and some of those we ought to be serving outside the church, have forgotten how to look. They've forgotten how to sing the song to which Thoreau adverted when he opined that most people live lives of quiet desperation and go to their graves with the song still in them. Many people, and too many of our own people, have forgotten about the flame within, or that fluffy bird within that Jamie reminded us about. That flame, that bird that wants to fly, that flame that wants to shine. They've forgotten what we're here to do. When Jesus called the first disciples, and later when he talked about them, calling them friends, and when he called on them to bear fruit that will last, he was reminding them, and through us, down the ages, us, that we've got what it takes to do the work he's given us to do. But that work takes time and energy and continuity and perseverance. He also continually reminds us that what was said of us back on page 1 of the Bible is true. That we are made of God stuff, star quality, which makes us at base good stuff. And again, very good stuff. Children of God, loved prodigally beyond our wildest imagination. And this is the very kind of stuff we have to learn and then relearn continually until we finally get it into our heads and our hearts and into our hands and let it loose on the world. It's the very kind of stuff we need to be modeling for all those others who are always watching us and always exegeting every move we make. We need to be modeling others and helping them to believe. In a world where there's so much hasty judgment and unjustified anger and greed, and some of it purporting to be, of all things, the face of God, we have a rare opportunity to turn the other face to the world. The one that we know. The one that the trees of the Psalms continually applaud. The face that shines with love and grace and acceptance is precisely the sort of face that our world needs so desperately to see more often. And it can, with our help. To commit to this sort of loving, this sort of bearing, is exactly what our baptism and the commitment to lifelong Christian formation and the commitment to being and making disciples of Jesus Christ, precisely what all of that calls us to do. And then, what we're doing, and what we think we're doing, and what people who watch us make of what we're doing, all of those things come together. All those in favor say, I will with God's help.